Good day, students. Today we are looking at exploring the nature, elements, and uses of history. This is your introductory lesson to what exactly is history. Let's get straight into it. At the end of this lesson, students, you should be able to define the term history, describe the difference between a primary and secondary source, identify primary and secondary sources, describe the use of historical sources to historians, and show a sense of appreciation for the work of historians. We are here looking at a definition for history. We are trying to formulate a definition for history by actually looking at a few of the sources that historians use in order to reconstruct the past. Here we have letters, monuments, and also books. Of course, the sources utilized by historians varies, and it includes tombstones, diaries, oral accounts, a host of artifacts that are utilized to reconstruct man's past. By looking at these sources, we can safely say that historians conduct research. They record information, they interpret information, and therefore we can safely say that history is the past recorded and interpreted experiences of man. Guys, let us take a closer look at the material used by historians to reconstruct the past. Remember, they are divided into primary and secondary sources. Look and listen closely to get a better understanding of the differences between the two types.
But don't worry, because we'll explain the differences here so that you can decide which are best to use in your assignment. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of an event, topic, or historical time period. Anything that contains original information on a topic is considered a primary source. Examples of primary sources include things like letters or personal diaries or journals, original photographs, speeches, newspaper reports, creative works like paintings, plays, and music, and research data or surveys. It's a good idea to use primary sources in research papers because it allows you to form your own argument to defend your thesis, since the information you're using is unfiltered by another person's point of view. You're able to critique an original work using your own ideas. Secondary sources interpret, critique, or analyze primary sources. It is information that is created or published from primary sources. Examples of secondary sources include things like textbooks, essays or reviews, encyclopedias, newspaper articles that analyze or discuss events and ideas, and criticisms and commentaries. It's a good idea to use secondary sources in research papers because you can learn about new perspectives that you may not have even considered, and they can also strengthen your own argument in the assignment. For example, if you're writing a history paper about how the diversity of a city shifted during a certain time period, you could use data from the U.S. Census Bureau to compare populations across the decades. This type of information would be considered a primary source, as it's data that's simply been collected and compiled. There is no analysis. That's what you'll be doing in the paper. For the same topic, you could also use an article from a newspaper that reviews the data and draws conclusions or analysis from it, such as other ways in which the population might change or grow over time. Some sources, like scholarly journals and newspapers, can serve as both a primary and a secondary source, depending on which article you're reading. Articles that include things like eyewitness accounts or interviews and are published close to the time of the event you're researching would be a primary source. Articles that are published after the fact and include analysis or critiques are secondary sources. Primary and secondary sources can both strengthen and improve your research immensely by providing you with information to create an argument and defend your thesis statement. Now that you know how to differentiate between them, try using them in your own assignment.
We pause at this time, guys, to reflect on what we have learned thus far. But before we get there, let us just differentiate again the difference between a primary and a secondary source. A primary source is raw data, information or objects gathered from a point in time of an historical event. For example, the Morant Bay Rebellion. Let's say there were letters that were written between Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. Those letters would be considered primary sources because they were taken from that point in time in history when the event actually transpired. If historians were to utilize those letters along with newspaper articles and interpreted that information along with any other artifact that they could gather, and then create a history book about the Morant Bay Rebellion based on their interpretation of these sources, then that would become a secondary source. The books that they have written on the Morant Bay Rebellion would be the secondary source because they were built on primary sources. They were built from the interpretation of primary sources, and they are after the fact, after the event had transpired. Now, here we have history text, academic journal, and diary. Which of the following do you think is a primary source? If you guess diary, then you are correct. I knew you could get this right. The diary is the primary source. A diary would have been drawn and interpreted from the point in time of a historical event, and that would make it a primary source. It's raw data taken from a particular point in time of an historical event of significance. Guys, let us recap by looking at truths related to history. History is an interpretation of man's past experiences. Historians rely on historical sources to rebuild the past. Historical sources are divided into two main types. These are primary and secondary. Some sources, however, fall within the category of both primary and secondary sources, and this is dependent on when the information was gathered. We are now down to our activity session, and to complete, you are required to do exercises 1, 2, 3, and 4 in your workbook, Exploring General Studies Workbook 1. Remember, take care of yourselves, wash your hands, and always wear a mask when interacting with others.